Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another riveting episode of Krista's Fireside Lectures. I hope that you all had a great weekend, and I hope that some of you got the rain that came past. This week, we are continuing with our lecture on ethics. Now, firstly, I want you guys to make sure that you put your name in the comments below. Please just claim your space. I'm still trying to take a register and make sure that I can see who's watching these things. Now, you guys did ethics in first year, but we really did gloss over it briefly, and just to give you a general idea of what ethical conduct is about in the press. But we're going to go into it in a little bit more detail. I'm not going to go through the ethical theories with you guys. If you need me to make a video on the ethical theories, then please say so in the comments. If you don't understand the ethical theories, please say so in the comments. You can also ask me questions in the comments and directly via the WhatsApp group or email. Please remember that. But for now, we're going to look at the importance of ethics in journalism because, as you know, there is such a thing as the power of the press. And this is a quote that I took from the interwebs. The media's most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. And that's power, because they control the minds of the masses. If you are a journalist and you write for a publication, you have the power to direct what people think, and also you have the power to direct what people are talking about. You have the power to direct what people focus on. Now, the press is an amazing thing because as journalists, we can direct people's focus on things that are important in the country, things that are happening that general, awareness doesn't allow, government documents, pending bills, which we'll get onto just now. And the press is entitled, very much like the bards of old, to criticize whatever they feel is worthy of criticism. That is the rights of free speech, and we have the rights of free speech in this country. The press, as an independent body, has the right to say what they feel should be said, okay? But the responsibility of free speech is that you shouldn't be saying things that are untrue. You should not be implying that people are doing things if you don't know that they are doing them. Now, who watches the watchers? Okay, the watchers are us, the journalists. We watch and we see what's going on and we report on it. But who controls us? Who regulates us? The whole idea of a free press is that we don't really have regulators. We don't have people to regulate us. What happens if the government decides to regulate us? That's the question. I mean, we've got a responsibility to our advertisers. And if, say, for example, Shell and BP are advertising every single week in your weekly newspaper, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of rands a month, then, you don't really want to say too much about, them maybe abusing the environment and ignoring health and safety concerns for their workers. You're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place because as a publication, you want to report on the news, but at the same time, there's this very, very dominant corporate control that is emerging all over the world. What do we report on and how do we report on it, especially if these massive oligopolies are going to pull their funding? Pulling their advertising means that we can't sustain ourselves. So it is a fine line that we have to walk, but that doesn't mean that we must now self-censor just because we're afraid of offending the people that are giving us money. If we do that, then then there is no integrity in journalism. But at the same time, we've also got the state. The state says, you should have this code of conduct. There are protocols that we have put in place. There are norms that the society expects of you. There are things that, we expect of you. You should not criticize the government because it destabilizes our regime. And, there are all of these ideas that force or act to censor journalists. Journalists do have a duty to the state. Journalists have a duty to ensure that what they print does not unnecessarily destabilize the state, in the sense that, you can't just print South Africa is going to war with Mozambique if it's not true. Because what happens, if people see that? They stop buying things, the economy collapses, people outside of the country stop investing. And as much as the state might deny it, no one really believes what they say anyway. So if you print something, you have to make sure that what you're saying is true. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should allow the state to censor you in the same way that you shouldn't allow the your corporate investors to censor you. A free press should be free, which is why we are independent. In China and North Korea, the government controls the media, and they are increasingly controlling the media all the time. Independent journalists in China can no longer make a living. They get fined, they get locked up if they criticize anything to do with the state. But there is a much more insidious way to censor journalists. This is something that the apartheid government used to do. They didn't actually lock up all the journalists and shut down all the publications. What they did was they imposed fines. They imposed lots and lots and lots of fines on anyone who reported critically on the government. And now we see a Film and Publications Amendment Bill, which looks like, there's a lot of comment on it at the moment, which is very, very positive because the media are speaking out against it. But they've kind of sneakily sort of added in this one little section here. It says, any person who knowingly distributes or exhibits in public a film or game without first having been registered with the board as a distributor or exhibitor of films or games shall be guilty of an offence and liable upon conviction to a fine not exceeding 150,000 rand or to imprisonment for a period not exceeding 8 months, or both to a fine and such imprisonment. Now, this is a really interesting little snippet of legislation that they've snuck into this amendment bill. A bill is something that has to be discussed by Parliament, has to be worked on, and then put out for comment to the public, and then after that then they make amendments again, or they edit it, and then when it is passed it becomes an act. Okay? And this little snippet here is quite innocuous because they're basically saying on the top, on the surface, they're saying anyone who wants to sell movies or games without being registered as a distributor will be fined or imprisoned. And you think, well, yeah, okay, cool. So it's, going to stop child pornography and it's going to stop piracy, and that's all great. But let's look at what they actually define as film in the same piece of legislation. Any sequence of visual images recorded in such a manner that by using such recording, such images will be capable of being seen as a moving picture, and includes any picture intended for exhibition through any medium, including using the internet or device. Which means that if you want to make a live video, just like this one, in fact, for movies or for for YouTube, for your Facebook page, for your Twitter account, you have to register it first. And you have to basically pass it by the government for approval. So obviously we can see that this is not able to be enforced by the government. I mean, the government can't stop you from making your live Facebook updates and stuff like that. But what it can do is act as a lever for the government to identify people who are critical of what they are doing, identify videos such as the one that I presented to you on Morning Shot, and basically shut them down. If you make a video that is critical of the government, they can target you and shut you down, fine you and imprison you using this piece of legislation. And this is the kind of thing that governments, generally communist governments or authoritarian governments, will use. They'll sort of slip it in there really sort of casually, under the guise of preventing child pornography, which of course I'm very much personally against. I don't agree that children should feature in films of any kind against their will, clothed or naked or any other. You're exposing children to all kinds of things just by putting pictures of your children on Facebook. But my opinions aside, what this means for our country is that if you are critical of the government and you make a video, they can term it a film and they can use this piece of legislation, if it is included in the final act, to target you and shut you down, which obviously will result, as it did in the apartheid era, not in censorship where the jails are full of people with Facebook posts, but in a form of self-censorship where people will stop doing these things. So I just wanted to bring your attention to that, because this is a way that governments do tend to control the press, and this is what we're working against as journalists in the media. We don't want this kind of thing. We want to be free to be able to report on what we need to report on. But having said that, we need to also show some kind of responsibility for the power that we wield. We have to be accountable. And that's where ethics comes in. Ethics does not rely on the law. Ethics relies on social norms, values, and the press code in the media, the South African Press Code of Conduct, enables us to make ethical decisions using guidelines given by the press code. So, of course, yes, we've got one nation under control if the government is actually enabled to prosecute critical voices. Then what happens? All of the criticism, all of the voices of dissent disappear, and we have, as you can see, one nation under the control of the government. We don't want that. We want to say we can stand up on our own and regulate ourselves, which is why we need to be independent. That is why governments ideally should not meddle with the press. And that is why we need our own code of ethics by which to govern ourselves. Now, we've got a case study here. I've put this into your lesson as well for the last 2 weeks. For last week and this week. With a little research task as well. And the case study is this. When is including the word alleged not enough? Because when we look at ethical writing, we look at the responsibility that we wield, or the responsibility that we as journalists have to wield our power to the benefit of society, and not just, throwing stuff around just so that we can make money. Making money is not the be-all and end-all of journalism. In fact, if you want to be a journalist so you can make lots of money, just do something else rather, because it really should not be about the money. So what happened was, in the Sunday Times, they published a series of articles. The first one labeled the police unit in the Cato Manor in KZN. Cato Manor is just outside of Durban. They labeled the police unit a death squad. Now, death squads are something that authoritarian regimes use to keep the populace in check. You know, the death squad goes out, identifies people that are, you know, troublesome in some way to the government, and kills them. And this is pretty hectic as far as allegations go. I mean, yeah, they called it a death squad in the headline, and of course it's sensationalist and it's glamorous and it makes people want to read, and lots of people bought the newspaper for that because it was a death squad. And everyone knows what a death squad is. It's a bunch of cops that go around shooting people that are troublesome to the government. So this police unit was labeled a death squad, and despite the fact that, you know, they didn't really have enough evidence to back up their claims, they used this term to describe this unit. That is an unethical headline, because nowhere else in the whole history of this police unit did they identify themselves as a death squad, or, you know, were they identified as a death squad by anybody else. The journalist, the editor, came up with the headline. Okay? So, that's one of the ways in which they breached the press code of conduct, the ethical code that they are supposed to use to make right and good decisions. Using those two words, death squad, was not a right and good decision. It did not benefit anybody. It didn't benefit, well, okay, it benefited the bottom line of the newspaper because they sold lots and lots of papers, but, you know, labeling this police unit as a death squad was not beneficial to the public, to the people of Cato Manor, which is still in turmoil, by the way. So, and it didn't benefit the police, it didn't benefit anybody. And when we look at ethics, we look at the greatest benefit, how the media is expected to conduct themselves normally in society to benefit the public. Secondly, of the 18, there were 45 suspicious murders, and 18 of them were investigated by the reporters on this story. And of those, some of them were ruled as valid deaths that were not suspicious by the courts. But they failed to include this information in their articles in a way that gave those court rulings equal importance. So it wasn't fair and balanced reporting. Now, if you take a look at a lot of the reporting that goes on these days, there's a lot of alleged being thrown around, alleged robbers in the alleged housebreaking and, whatever. And usually that kind of suffices to provide a bit of a backstop or, cover the bases, as it were, for the journalist writing the story. But ethical writing also means that you need to be honest and fair in all of the information. Don't withhold certain things or certain facts just because it doesn't fit your own narrative in your story. That is unethical. Also, if you include information, make sure that you give it the importance and the validity that it deserves within your story. Don't just go, oh, by the way, but the court ruled that. But these were all very suspicious. You can't do that. It's unethical. you have to, if it is a court ruling, it is valid and it is very important because it is an official ruling. You cannot just dismiss it or diminish its importance because it doesn't serve your narrative. That is unethical. They also, there was a dude who was sort of eventually in charge of this whole unit. He was actually in charge of several units, General Johan Boysen. And what the writers did was they said that he was directly in charge of that particular unit. So they almost created this idea of this covert like death squad with this one dude sitting in a dark room somewhere going, this is the list, you know, and then the guys go out and they just slaughter everybody. And it wasn't like that because this guy, Johan Boysen, was actually in charge of a whole bunch of units, a whole bunch of cops. And there was a chain of command that the journalists ignored. They sort of cut out all of the other people in between him and the unit and sort of just directly joined them together, which is unethical because now you're distorting the facts to present a sort of fictional view of what happened. Distorting the facts to serve your own narrative is unethical. You can't just change things or ignore facts or present the facts in such a way that you are changing them around to suit your own narrative. It doesn't work that way. It is unethical. And then lastly, and most importantly, I feel, they ignored an underlying political agenda. The Cato Manor unrest, which has been happening for many, many years, is a political one. It is purely politically based. It's you know, you can't separate what's going on in Cato Manor from the political factions that are causing it. And what these journalists did was they just went, there's a death squad, there's a dude in charge who is sending the death squad out to shoot or beat to death or whatever unruly citizens. No political agenda here at play. We will ignore it because it doesn't suit us and it is inconvenient for us to investigate that. And so they didn't. They just ignored it. And again, you cannot ignore the sort of the underlying questions. I mean, if you live in Durban, you know about Cato Manor. You know that there is political unrest. It's a politically motivated issue. Sorry guys, it's my dog again. So if you are investigating anything which appears to be tied to a political agenda or political feud of some kind, you need to ask those questions. You have to ask those questions. They are part of the story. If you feel like you cannot answer those questions, either dig deeper or hand on the story. But don't just ignore it because it's too difficult. It's very it's not just unethical, but it's lazy reporting. You know, I hate to say that because the reporters that worked on this story are actually really well recognized, very, very good reporters, and I have a lot of respect for them. I have no idea why they ignored this because they should have seen it. They're good enough. Their writing is amazing. They've come up with these amazing stories in the past. Why they ignored this underlying political agenda, that's a good question. We don't know. But it was unethical for them to not include that particular factor into the report. Any of the reports, in fact. So that's your one case study. Now, and what I did here was I said, when is including the word alleged not enough? It's not enough just to include the word alleged. If you're going to omit facts, ignore facts, distort facts, or present facts in an unbalanced or unfair way. You can't just throw in the word alleged and think that it's okay, because it's not. It's unethical. Okay, next case study. So, City Press, a long time ago, like in 2003, I think it was, City Press published a story on the head of the I think it was the National Prosecuting Authority. It was a very, very long time ago, but you will have read about this last year in your JRN2 textbooks, and I'm fairly certain that I went over it, at least with my Durban group I did. When an allegation changes the course of a country. Now, this is the thing that you have to remember as journalists, that if you publish something, it can have far-reaching effects. You might think, it's going to be great, I'm going to get an award for my investigative journalism, and everything will be great, and the editor will go, yeah, we're going to make lots of money off this. But what happens when your allegation actually changes the course of a country? Can you imagine what would have happened if things had gone differently? I've given you the link here. So if you don't remember, you can go back. But basically, the headline of the City Press article implied that Bulelani Ngcuka, the head of the National Prosecuting Authority, I think it was an apartheid spy. Now, if anybody, and you guys should know this by now, if anybody in the country is in any way linked publicly to apartheid in any way, they immediately lose their standing in the whole world. Like, they may as well just crawl up under a rock and die, because you don't count anymore. You have no status, no voice, no agency, no nothing. If you were part of apartheid, sorry, you lose. You're voted off the island, and just, don't come back. And this guy was a very well respected, very capable, and probably, maybe less corrupt, I don't know. But a government official, okay? And City Press published this headline, was Bulelani Ngcuka an apartheid spy? And they gave him a whole, spy code name and everything. But the journalist who actually wrote the story, okay, she was writing for the Sunday Times at the time, Rajani Munsami. She's still actually around and in a position of authority. I don't know why, but she wrote the story, and it had been kicking around news houses for a little while, but no one had actually verified any of it. But she sent it to the City Press because her editor at the Sunday Times did not want to publish the article. Okay, so that first red flag right there. She sent it to City Press, and they ran the story. And of course, Bulelani Ngcuka was not an apartheid spy. This was proven later in a whole commission that was set up to actually investigate these allegations. But by the time that it happened, by the time the Heifer Commission actually cleared Ngcuka of being an apartheid spy and found out what actually had happened, he had already resigned, because if you are accused of anything to do with apartheid, then, like I said, you're voted off the island, and he couldn't keep his position. So the headline implied that he was an apartheid spy. That was in itself unethical, because they had no actual proof. Secondly, the information was not interrogated for a political agenda. It turns out that the guy who gave the information on Bulelani Ngcuka was actually a friend of Zuma's, and he felt a little bit butthurt about the fact that his friend was being investigated by the Scorpions for fraud. And so he wanted to do something to kind of level the playing field, which meant that, he saw it as 1 for 1. If they've got, if they've got dirt on Zuma and they're investigating him for fraud, then let's see if we can't, give an eye for an eye or take an eye for an eye and implicate Nguga in the apartheid machinery in some way. Which, of course, no one actually questioned. The information, was not interrogated for a political agenda by this journalist, and certainly not by the city press editor. They just published it. They didn't ask why this guy was coming forward, and that is unethical. You cannot, as a journalist, allow yourself to be manipulated by people who have their own agenda and who want to use your power, remember that, your power over the people, over the masses, to their own ends. So as a result of this, Nguga resigned. The Scorpions were disbanded during the investigation of Zuma and the fraud and corruption charges. And so obviously no charges were brought against Zuma, and he was free to become president. Those allegations, just that headline, changed the course of the country. What would have happened if they hadn't printed the story, if the investigation had gone forth, the Scorpions hadn't been disbanded? Because Nguga resigning actually opened the doors to a whole bunch of sort of knock-on effects, which included the Scorpions being disbanded in the middle of their investigation, which meant the investigation was dropped and Zuma just basically walked. And now, of course, the charges have been brought back again into light, and he's facing these charges again. But by this time, the damage is already done. If you take a look at what happened afterwards, and obviously that's your opinion. We've got Zuma supporters here in the audience who believe that he had every right to do what he did. And again, you're entitled to your opinion. So that is our case study. When an allegation changes the course of a country, what you say in your writing can affect a whole country, a whole economy, a whole group of people. And it's very insidious the way that people can be used, and the way that journalists can sometimes use their writing to present a particular agenda. You must be aware of your own prejudices. You must be aware of what your thoughts and feelings are on certain things. For example, if you are a black journalist and you really, really hate white people because you had a bad experience with a white person in the past and you don't trust any of them, to be perfectly honest, you're entitled to your prejudices. Every person is entitled to their prejudices. Okay? You can't just deny it. You can't say it doesn't exist. But you cannot allow it to affect the way that you present information in your writing. Because as a journalist, it's not for you to impose your views and your opinions and your beliefs and your prejudices on your audience. You have a responsibility to remove all of that from your writing and not let it affect the way that you present information in a story. I think that's it for today. I would like to just point out that ethical writing, ethical journalism is particularly important now in this country right now, because we are going through a lot of major changes. We are almost setting ourselves up for a major upheaval in our country. Our economy is, to all intents and purposes, not even on the brink anymore. It is collapsing. Our government is unable to investigate corruption because it is almost entirely complicit in the corruption that it is investigating. And people are speaking out more and more. As journalists, we have a responsibility to ensure that when we write about these events, that we are presenting the most fair, factual, balanced, and honest story that we can to the public. Because what we do now as journalists, if you get a job as a journalist and you are writing for an audience in South Africa, what you do can conceivably affect the course that our country takes. So bear that in mind. Ethics are there to ensure that journalists are able to make right and good decisions, and we can hold ourselves accountable for what we do. And on that note, I am going to say goodbye to you all. Love you lots, and don't stop asking questions. Love you, bye.